Hi everyone, I'm Julia with the Berkeley Judicial Institute, back with another installment of Judges in the Community. Today, we're joined by Judge Jeremy Fogel, here to share his work with the Berkeley Judicial Institute and teaching high school students the Constitution. Good morning, Judge Fogel. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your morning to be here. I can't wait to dive into your journey and insights. But just to start out, would you mind briefly sharing about a little more about who you are, where you sit, and your personal judicial history?
Of course, and it's great to be with you, Julia. It's always good to see you. So it's a long journey. I mean, I was a judge for a very long time. I started when I was young. I was appointed to the state court bench when I was 31 years old, and so I served on the state courts in San Jose, California, for 17 years, and then in 1998 was appointed to the federal court to the Northern District of California, and I served there for 20 years. In the last 7 of those years, I was actually in Washington, D.C., serving as the director of the Federal Judicial Center, which is the federal agency that provides education and research for the federal judiciary. So I had the opportunity in 37 years to hear just about every kind of case that a trial judge hears. I mean, my first assignment when I began was hearing drunk driving cases, and I heard lots and lots of those. I went from doing that to doing family law cases, which were actually a very significant part of my career and very formative. Did all kinds of civil cases, criminal cases. By the time I got to the federal court, Silicon Valley had become Silicon Valley. I mean, San Jose changed greatly over the years that I served there, and I did many, many patent cases toward the end of my federal career, and along the way had some pretty significant political and policy cases as well. So I really got to do just about everything.
Yeah, thank you so much for your amazing introduction. It's such an honor to speak with you. And now, diving straight into the core of our conversation today, what work are you here to share with us, and where did it all begin?
Okay, well, I finished my term at the Federal Judicial Center, which we call the FJC. I finished that in 2018, and at that point, I was still a federal judge, and I could have gone back to my court in San Jose and continued hearing cases just as I had before. And I wasn't sure I really wanted to do that because I like being a teacher. I like being an educator and getting to work on the curriculum for judges that I got to work on at the FJC. And I had gotten to know Erwin Chemerinsky, who, as you know, is the dean of the law school at Berkeley. And he had been one of our go-to faculty members. He was somebody we always asked for his thoughts about constitutional law and the Supreme Court. And so we had gotten to know each other pretty well. And right around the time that I left the FJC, Erwin became the dean at Berkeley. It was a kind of a coincidence in time. And we were talking at one point that he thought it would be really interesting to have a center that studied the judiciary, not in the sense of like teaching judges how to run calendars or things like that, but like what does it mean to be a judge, and what are the things that judges have to think about and deal with, and there really isn't anything like that in the United States. It's kind of a think tank almost that we uh, and the more he and I talked, the more I thought to myself, this is really what I'd like to do. This really appeals to me. I've been a judge for a long time, and a chance to sort of think more broadly about what the judiciary is and what being a judge is all about appealed to me a great deal. And so we had a number of really productive conversations, and he invited me to come to Berkeley, and I got some seed grant from the Hewlett Foundation to start the Berkeley Judicial Institute, and the rest is history. And I've been there for 7 years now, going on 8, and really having just a wonderful time. It's been in many ways the best job I've ever had. And we have a sort of a three-pronged mission statement. One of the things we focus on is judicial independence, and I'll say a little bit more about that because that's where the teaching high school students comes in. Judicial independence, ethics, teaching judges and others about the importance of ethical conduct, and resilience, which really translates into health and wellness, helping judges maintain their mental and physical health so that they can handle what is really a very difficult and stressful job. So those are our sort of our three main areas of focus and have been since the beginning. I think in 2025, the judiciary is facing challenges to its role, to the whole notion of judicial independence and the rule of law that are unique in our time, at least. I don't think it's never happened before. If you look back in the history of our country, there have been periods like that, but we are dealing with something that's, I think, in our lifetimes unprecedented. And so, how can the judiciary meet that challenge? And a lot of the work I've been doing for most of this year really has been figuring out ways to talk on one hand to judges, what is your experience trying to um, maintain your independence and to act in accordance with the rule of law, which simply means that you decide cases based on the facts and the law rather than something else. That you're not the politics or who wants what outcome, but it's a process where you find facts based on evidence and you apply law that already exists, that's on the books. You have either statutes or you have precedents or what have you. So judges are facing that internal challenge. And then I think what we'll talk about this morning is how do you talk about that to people who aren't judges, people who aren't lawyers? And I think that turns out to be quite a challenge. Part of the problem is that sitting judges, people who are actually still hearing cases, can't talk about the cases that they're hearing. The ethics codes prevent them from doing that. They're very explicit that you're not allowed to talk about pending cases. And so that's one problem. And then another problem is that we are a profession that has its own language, its own way of communicating. And if you think about this, if you were to go to a meeting, a gathering, a conference of doctors, and say it was some specialty. I mean, my son's a surgeon, so this comes to mind very easily. Then there's a gathering of surgeons, and they're talking about their work. And if you didn't have any medical training, you'd kind of sit there and you'd listen to you had no idea what they were talking about, or you would know generally what their work was, but that's about it. And I think people who aren't part of the legal profession and aren't part of the judging profession quite often just what we're saying to ourselves, and we all understand it, we all feel very comfortable with it. To them, it sounds pretty much like the same thing that you might happen in the example that I just gave. And so, two really key principles here. So, we talk a lot about judicial independence. We talk a lot about the rule of law. We talk about how judicial independence is under siege now. We talk about how the rule of law is under siege now. And if you go outside of our bubble, I don't think that many people, whether it be high school students or adults, necessarily know what you're talking about. In other words, so what is judicial independence? If I were to just sort of go to a high school class, what does judicial independence mean? And I think a lot of the students would say it means the judge can do whatever they want. And well, it is not what judicial independence means. But people hear it that way. I mean, they hear it as being, well, I mean, you can't tell me what to do. I can decide this case any way I want. Well, that's just not what it means. And what is the rule of law? Well, I don't know that you can give anybody could kind of come up with a short and sweet definition of what the rule of law is. I mean, when I've tried to talk about it with lay groups, I always say, well, there's different pieces to it. That one of them is that the decisions are based on evidence. They're not based on who the parties are, or who's your cousin, or who's paid you money, or it's like you're deciding the case based on the evidence, and you're applying legal principles that exist, and they're the framework for the decision that you make. So you have decision making that's based on evidence and existing rules. You give people a right to be heard. It's this idea of due process. It just means that everybody gets a chance to be heard. I mean, it doesn't mean you get to be heard forever and say whatever you want, but you get to you have an opportunity to explain why you think you should win the case. And and then you have this, I think a big part of it is that ethics plays into it, that the judge is honest, that the judge actually hears the testimony and applies the law and listens to everybody as carefully as they can. And then they make a decision based on that rather than something else. And so we count on that. That's the rule of law. You have evidence-based decisions, and you have due process, and you have ethical adjudicators, and that if you don't like the outcome, you don't ignore it. You don't, go to the judge's house and threaten them. You appeal. There's higher courts, and you appeal, and you say that there was an error made, and if you keep on going up the chain, and you go as far as you can, and sometimes you win, and sometimes you don't. And to me, one of the best examples of the rule of law in the United States, and it's not a happy one for some people, is we had a presidential election in 2000 where the Supreme Court basically decided that Al Gore's challenge to the vote count in Florida was going to stop, and that allowed George Bush to become president. And so that's a very consequential decision that was made by the Supreme Court. We didn't have a revolution. We didn't have riots in the streets. I mean, people accepted that the decision was going to be made by the courts, and it was. And that's how I talk about the rule of law and try to explain it in ways that are relatable to people. And so I think a big part of talking to high school students or adults, and I think some of my favorite outreach has actually been to retirement communities. I've gone to a couple, and I've just had some really, really interesting conversations. So you put that information out, and then you really have to let people ask questions. I think such a big part of making this stuff relatable to people is meeting them where they are. So you start with explaining things in plain language, trying to get the legalese out of it, and just sort of trying to explain it in a very practical way. And then you inevitably will get questions, and it's they're all the questions are all over the place. The questions are, aren't all the justices of the Supreme Court bought and sold by rich donors, or something, or how come uh, judges are so lenient with repeat offenders, or you'll get all these questions from people, and you really have to be, I think, very mindful about where those questions are coming from, and instead of just saying, well, that's not true, or I'm going to just defend the system, or so tell me more about why you think that. I mean, why do you think that there's corruption on the Supreme Court? Or why do you think that sentencing judges are too lenient? And where is that information coming from? And that's always very interesting to me, because a lot of times it's coming from something you saw on social media, or something you heard on a podcast, and it's like that's how people get information now. And so it's sort of just being attentive to that, and really being willing to engage and take people seriously. So I think there's a real art to this, and I don't think that most judges know how to do it. I think most judges want to do it, but they don't know how to do it. So there's a big focus now on developing communication skills. This is Project BJI has been working on, and we've been collaborating with some other organizations in doing that. In fact, when we get done, I have another meeting in about a half hour after that with a group of people who are working on that. Like, how do you get judges at both the state and federal level comfortable going out in the community and really meeting people where they are? So it's more than civics education. I mean, this is much. When I hear people talk about civics education, I don't have any problem with it. I think it's a fine thing, but it's more than just telling people there's three branches of government. I mean, that's part of it, but I mean, it really is sort of listening to where people are, what people think, and I mean, for a lot of people, the only experience they've had with the courts is like if they got a traffic ticket or something, or if they watch a show on TV. And the shows on TV, let me tell you that they are almost always misleading, and things happen that I mean, I stopped watching lawyer shows very early in my career because it would drive me crazy because stuff was just wrong. You know, they would get the law wrong. Things would happen in the case for dramatic effect that would never happen in a real courtroom. And I guess my favorite one is that you can't have a movie about judges where they aren't pounding their gavel. And I have had a gavel for 44 years. I got one when I started on the courts in 1981, and I have never used it ever. It's completely ornamental. And so just it's a small thing, but it's just little things like that the reality of what happens in court is very different. And unless you've had a case yourself, or really have taken the time to study it, you just are going to have a somewhat misleading understanding. And I think these kind of really honest, open conversations are how you begin to change that. And I'll just add one more thing, that the people who actually have the best understanding, I mean, the non-lawyer, non-judges who have the best understanding of what actually happens in court are people who've served on juries. And it's really interesting. There's been some pretty good social science data on this. If you poll people who've been on juries, they are pretty positive about the courts, and they're almost universally will say that their opinion of the courts is improved as a result of their jury service. That what they experienced was much better than they thought it was going to be, and I think that's really significant.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on various groups that that you've interacted with when teaching them about the judiciary. I kind of was interested in, are there any stories in particular that kind of stand or speak out to the kind of impact you want to make and continue to make on the community?
Um, I would say that, and as I mentioned this a minute ago, uh, there's one particular retirement community that I've actually visited twice. I went once and spent about an hour there, and then they invited me back, and I spent another hour there, and they asked so many questions, and they were such good questions. I mean, these were people who, they were mostly in their 70s and 80s, and they had, you know, observed courts over the course of their lives, and they had a lot of questions, and they were serious questions. I mean, they were really wondering about, do judges really decide cases in accordance with the law? Or, I mean, does it really matter who the appointing president is in a federal case? I mean, isn't it? I mean, people worry that this is all kind of locked in based on that, and then there are questions like about the Supreme Court saying, well, the judges appear like they act like they get along with each other, but they couldn't possibly, given how differently they see the world. And I had the great privilege of getting to spend time with the court and get to know some of the justices when I was at the FJC. Well, so they would ask me about this, and I could say, this is what my experience has been. I mean, I'm not here to convince you of anything. I would say, like on the first question, that probably 95% of the cases that are decided in the district courts, the trial level, it doesn't matter what the party affiliation of the judge is. It just doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you're finding facts, which is a skill set, and then you're applying the law to the facts. And if you stray from that, if you decide the case based on some other reason, like I don't like this party, or I'm trying to accomplish this policy objective or something like that, it's not really something that among your peers, in the judicial community, I mean, you're not going to get a lot of respect for that. That's just not the norm. It's not the way things are done. And I got to be, part of it's my personality, I guess, but I mean, I got to be friends with judges all over the country over the course of my career, especially, as FJC director, because I had to travel a lot. and I developed really close relationships with people with whom I disagree pretty profoundly about some political things. But that wasn't the point. We have the same job, we have the same values. We're trying to do the job in the same way, and we have respect for each other's seriousness and commitment to the values of the profession. So there's really that. I'm trying to convey that in most of the time in the district court, a judge's judicial philosophy is much less important than how conscientious they are and how carefully they do their job. I mean, it's different, when you get to courts of appeals and certainly on the Supreme Court, policy preferences do make a difference. But I think just making this point that a lot of the work really is not ideological and that it's really possible for judges to make really close friendships and respectful relationships across ideologies. I think that's actually a very important thing, given how polarized our environment is. And then, to the other point I made, I mean, in talking about what the relationships are, in the Supreme Court or what the justices are like. I mean, I always get questions like that. They have some really serious divisions, and the divisions are reflective of how divided our country is and the polarization in our country, and the confirmation process is very polarized, and it's very expensive and it's very visible, and it's quite political, and those are real things. And it doesn't make me happy to say that, but I think part of this whole idea of talking to people where they are and doing outreach effectively is to be honest. And I'm not going to paper over these things. I think they try very hard to respect each other professionally. I think that's real, and I don't think there's anything phony about that. But I think the differences in the way one sees the world matter more in the higher courts than they do in the lower courts. So what I just gave you is sort of a capsule of something that I might have spent half an hour talking about it in this particular retirement community because they were just fascinated by it. They were really interested in it. And then they would ask about, cases that were pending. And since I'm retired, I can talk about cases. And I do talk about cases when I'm doing outreach. But it's interesting that I don't talk about them in a political sense. I don't say, oh, this case is just so bad. I can't believe that the court did that. I mean, they all ought to be run out of town. I mean, that's about 180 degrees opposite from what I try to do, which I just sort of try to explain what the issues in the case were, how the different justices or judges, came to the decision they came to, what the underlying legal disagreements are, policy disagreements, and just try to be illuminating rather than to take sides. And I think, there's all you can, you're not going to ever run out of people who take sides. I mean, it's a polarized area. You're going to find people who are on one side or the other of just about anything. But there are not a lot of judges who can tell you, like, how does the process actually work? How is the sausage made? How does it come out the way that it does? And I think that's a unique value that I and other retired judges can provide. So I think it's very important to try to do that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I kind of want to shift the spotlight onto you. And so when you collaborate or interact with the community as much as you do, I want to hear a little bit more about the personal impact this work has had on you. I know you are now retired as a judge, but kind of as a person of the judiciary, and in your personal life, how has this community engagement changed you as a person?
I think, Julia, I think this probably in terms of like personal satisfaction, this is the best job I've ever had. And I think part of it is just getting older and hopefully a little bit wiser, and just kind of the things you learn over the course of one's life. But I really think this has been such a neglected area, that all of our professions, it could be medicine, it could be law, it could be education, could be anything, mental health, which is where I started, way back when. Um, even religion, even organized religion, all of these different institutions, there's sort of a mystification of how they work, like what what the inner workings of it are and what the professionals in those fields do. And I think pulling the curtain back and making it relatable to people, why should you care? Why should you care about judicial independence? Why should you care when judges are threatened or their families are threatened? Why should you care that we have the rule of law and not some other kind of governance? And sort of figuring out how to talk to people about that. I mean, it just feels like really, really important work, So I don't wake up in the morning and say, well, I mean, I'm alienated and unhappy, and I'm just gonna, go off and distract myself. I mean, I really feel like I've never had a time in my life where I felt in my heart that the work I'm doing is as important as this work is. And that's a good way to feel, whenever you feel it in your life, but particularly when you're in your mid 70s like I am, that it's just it makes life worth living. And so it's had a tremendous impact on me.
Oh, I'd love to hear that. And,
Mhm.
we at BJI really appreciate all of your work. And
Mhm.
so I'm so glad that like it's as fulfilling as you say it is. And kind of for the last question, you kind of touched on this as well, but for those who are interested in starting those conversations and reaching out to the community as you do, I would love to know, what it takes to prepare or take action, any expert tricks you would like to share with the rest of the judicial community and beyond who are aspiring to get involved in such work.
Yeah, well, it's great. I mean, I think the main thing is to really think about who your audience is. I think this is the hardest thing. And so I mentioned this before, so I'm kind of repeating myself, but the hardest thing for judges, particularly people who've been judges a long time, is to figure out how to talk to people in a way that's not judgy. That it's not judge speak, that you're really trying to explain something that people don't know very much about. And so it's like being mindful of who your audience is and what information they're likely to have, where they're getting that information. I mean, it's been hard for me. I mean, I don't do social media. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, but passively, right? I don't do I don't do Instagram. I don't do Facebook. I don't watch TikTok. It's like so like I don't there are these all of these media that people interact through, young people that I don't really know anything about. I mean, I know that they're really influenced by them, but I have to remember I'm dealing with a group of people who don't have the same set of assumptions that I have. And so a lot of what I need to do is listen. So I might say something and say this is what I'm trying to do here, that this idea that all the different ways you could decide a case, right? If you had a case and you had to come to court, you know, I mean, I could decide the case based on your hair color. I could decide the case on who was willing to pay me the biggest bribe. I could decide the case based on, any number of other things that have nothing to do with the case, or I could decide the case based on the evidence. And the whole idea of the rule of law is that you decide cases based on evidence. This is the cornerstone of it. And that in getting the evidence, you really give people a chance to tell their story, and you listen to their story, and you engage with their story, and then you honestly apply the evidence to the law. And if you don't personally like the outcome, that's doesn't matter. I mean, that's not your job. It's not your job to like the outcome. Your job is to do the process right. So just explaining that and then getting all the questions people ask about that, or dealing with whatever cynicism they have about that or whatever they've heard about that, and a lot of what they heard is just completely unfounded. I mean, there have been attacks on judges of late, where they're accused of being, crazy, radical, this or that, and then if you look at the judge's career, there's absolutely no support for that at all. So, but the accusations are out there, and so how do you deal with that? How do you unpack that? And how do you say, well, tell me more about what you've heard, and what do you know about that? And you sort of give people a chance to tell you where they're coming from and listen. I think that's the main thing. I think we need to be good explainers and good listeners. And I think both of those are teachable skills and they're good skills, but I think those are my tips.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your work with the community. I'm sure many of those tuning in are as inspired as I am. And with that, as a member of the Berkeley Judicial Institute, I want to thank you, Judge Fogel, again so much for your amazing insights on your community engagement within and beyond the judicial world.
Well, thank you, Julia. It's fun to do this program. I've been following it with great admiration for a long time, so I'm glad I finally get to be part of it.